So thanks for all your work putting together the event today. So I'm really delighted to welcome John Norcross, who's over here from the States, to run the workshop this morning. John's distinguished professor and chair of clinical psychology at the University of Scranton. He's also a clinical professor of psychiatry at SUNY Upstate Medical University and a board certified clinical psychologist. John had a part-time practice of clinical psychology for 35 years and continues to practice in supervision as well as delivering training. John's output is incredible. He's written more than 400 publications and co-written or co-edited 22 books, and lots of them have gone into multiple editions and are real standards in the field. I first actually knew John's work through the book Psychotherapy Relationships at Work, which is a really paradigm-defining text, I think, that for the first time really brings together all the evidence on the psychotherapy relationship and really put the relationship at the heart, not just of what we know about practice, but also what we know about research and the evidence base. And I was amazed by John's was that he did work on existential therapies, one of the first researchers on existential approaches to therapy. Another major text that he's co-edited is the Handbook of Psychotherapy Integration, which I always massively strongly recommend, especially John's primer on psychotherapy integration. It's one of the great chapters on how you integrate and the different forms of integration and what it means to be an integrative practitioner. John's been elected president of the APA Division of Clinical Psychology, Division of Psychotherapy, International Society of Clinical Psychology, SEPI, Society of Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. He's really been at the heart of research on psychotherapy process and outcomes over the last number of decades. I just also want to say something about John personally. We were chatting at the weekend, we were wandering around the tape, and we were saying that one of the kind of marks, and for me this is a real truism, that marks of a kind of theory or a kind of practice is about the personality of the person who's developed it. Sometimes you see these kind of great theories, and then you meet the person who's developed it, and you think, oh my God, is that where it came from? And I think, on that basis, John is an absolutely monumental figure in the field. I've worked with John 5-6 years now. We first started working on our inventory of preference together, and I've known John as an enormously generous, thoughtful colleague to work with. A real humility, not one of these big egos that you solve to meet in our field, but somebody who's really able to, be very generous with his time and talks to people, and I've seen over the years how he's corresponded with people, and myself included, in a very warm, really lives out, I guess, the relational conditions that he'll be talking about today. So also having done some training with John, John's a fantastic trainer, so it's going to be a great morning today. Thank you so much for coming along. I really hope we get lots out of this session on the psychotherapy relationship that works. So John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, friends. Thank you for the warm welcome and that more than generous and incredibly inaccurate introduction by Mick. So yes, we have 3 hours. Relax, smoke them if you got them. I mean that metaphorically. Please don't start smoking on my account. So we're going to talk about the psychotherapy relationships and responsiveness at work. So I asked Mick how much skill training versus skills building. He said probably 70 to 80% of my talking. I think that's a massive mistake, but that's what we'll do. But you will see we're going to stop on 4 or 5 occasions, ask you to pair up into dyads, and to try some of these things that we know demonstrably work. The older I get, the more pragmatic I become. So when you keep seeing what works, yes, I now have 5 books in the title that work. Because otherwise, it is literally the worst of theory. Absolutely irrelevant to what we do. And it also helps, as Mick knows, to have a foot in actual practice. So you see patients, not just specialty clinic patients, they're the easy ones, We're talking about people who just come in and you have no idea what they're going to present with, or what they want, or what their preferences are, or what they're suffering from, or where they hope to go. That's the magic of psychotherapy. By the way, when I say psychotherapy, that's just my term. I know some of you prefer counseling, psychosocial treatment, art therapy, expressive therapies. So when I say psychotherapy, please just translate it into your own language. Now, as my way of thanking Mick and James, I'm going to begin with two hilarious jokes. As you probably saw, I'm from Scranton, the hometown of President Joe Biden, and also, more importantly, the fictional home of The Office, the American television classic. And yes, this is the American one, the funny one. By the way, that's purposeful because I just tried to create a bit of a rupture. So when we talk about repairing ruptures, that was it. I just insulted your national treasure, Ricky Gervais. The office in Scranton, by the way, the exteriors were my private practice building. So yes, we love it. So come to Scranton, because as we say, there ain't no party like a Scranton party, because a Scranton party don't stop. That's right, so we're very proud of our office. So here's the first joke. Ego and superego walk into a Scranton bar. They sit down, the bartender comes up and says, "I'm sorry, I can't serve you without seeing some ID." The behaviorists never laugh at that one. All right. You may know, for those of you who've seen the funny Office, the American version, know there was a character named Ryan who was actually one of the writers. When he applied for the job, he gave the following joke that won him the position. So Ryan says, "You know, I didn't learn much during college. It was my own fault, really. You see, I had a double major, psychology and reverse psychology." Well, even though they bombed, I am still grateful to be here in the Center for Research and Wellbeing. It's like never tell a joke in another country. It don't work. All right. So here's what we're going to do, friends. We're going to talk about relationships and responsiveness. Why? Because if we learned anything from 50 years of psychotherapy research, it's that we should be harnessing the most powerful sources of change, namely the therapeutic relationship and the patient, him or herself. So we begin by reviewing what works and what doesn't work in the therapy relationship. And remember, when I say the therapy relationship, you can say the counseling relationship, the psychosocial relationship, whatever you might like. Then we're going to practice one of those skills. This is the one nominated by Mick. That is identifying and repairing alliance ruptures. You'll see this works magnificently well. We're then going to talk about how to personalize psychotherapy and practice two of those. I'm one of the stages of change guys. So if you've ever heard pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance. Yes, that was my mentor, Jim Prochaska, with whom I work now the last 40 years. And stage of change is a state. That is, it's behavior specific. We're also going to learn to assess and quickly personalize to a trait measure of all your clients or patients. That would be reactance level. And when you do such transdiagnostic matching, that will demonstrably accelerate the process, reduce dropouts, and demonstrably improve therapy success. Because, as I said, as I get older, I'm more pragmatic. Show me stuff that works. Don't need another theory. I need to know what's going to help the person I'm with. Okay? So that's how we're going to roll. For those of you getting your CEs, or here called CPDs, right? Here are the sort of things we're going to do. You're going to be identifying these four elements of the therapy relationship. No worries, I'm presenting 12. You can forget 8. We're good. We're going to address in-session alliance ruptures. There's primarily two types: withdrawal, patient moves away from you or the work, and then there's the confrontive types. You'll assess reliably a client's stage of change within 1 minute. If you have a cooperative partner, by the way, it should be about 15 seconds. And tailor treatment to that stage. And then of the 8 ways we know that demonstrably work in personalizing psychotherapy, of the hundreds of client variables that have been proposed, you just need to remember 4 of those. So, we can do that. I got nothing for financial disclosures. In the States, we have to say that. So we're going to do this in 6 parts that perfectly parallel those learning objectives. So that's how I hope to roll, somewhere in the middle. We'll take a lovely break. By the way, no place I've ever been would have a 30-minute break for 3 hours. I'm not sure what that means. In the States, you get 5, maybe 10 minutes. So, well done. Well done, folks. All right. So, let me begin with this. A thought experiment. You're now Einstein. Okay? And we're going to practice a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment. You can also think about this in the States. We would call this the elevator pitch. You got 20 seconds on an elevator to explain to someone what you do or give an answer. Or the taxi drive question, when he says, so what do you do? So, how does psychotherapy really work? What accounts for the success of psychotherapy? So, you want to go on and give a dissertation, unacceptable, you got 20 seconds. And then as you're mulling that, how about if I ask you personally, what accounts for the success of your own personal therapy? In the States, and most of the studies I've seen, about 80 to 85% of US and UK practitioners will have undergone their own therapy. And some programs, of course, actually requiring it, or some form of personal development. So even if you're getting theoretical on how you help patients or clients, why did your personal therapy work, or alternatively did not work? Well, my colleagues, Dave Orlinsky, Justin Geller, and I have asked this question now about 50,000 times around the world, and the answer is remarkably similar. First, everybody wants to say many things account for success. So apparently in that unwritten graduate student manual, you answer every question with, it depends, and it's a complicated matter. So, next quiz, just start like that. You sound thoughtful, relativistic, and of course it's true. So you're going to tell me, well, it's the client, right, what they bring, it's the relationship, it's the therapist, it's the treatment method, it's the context. But when I say, come on, you got 20 seconds, what really matters? Over 93% of people, of mental health professionals around the world will say it's the relationship and it's the fit. And by the way, no one can even begin to discern what the fit means, but we all kind of know. A famous U.S. Supreme Court ruling could never define pornography either, so we simply say you know it when you see it. Well, you feel the fit when you experience it, right? You know it's a fit, and alternatively, right, you know when it's not a fit. So you know this in your bones, friends. You know it as a clinician practicing. You know it as a client who's been receiving this. It's the relationship and it's the fit. And this is not just as we like John's opinion. This is cold hard fact. As you'll see throughout the presentation, the effect sizes for the relationship and the fit are the highest effect sizes in all psychotherapy research. You want to impact psychotherapy success, emphasize the relationship and the fit. Okay. And when people ask, why do you talk about this? Because it matters the most, right? Because I'm an old fart now and I want to become pragmatic. Okay. So we started doing this about 25 years ago. Oh, I should mention the slides. I see people struggling. I don't know where the microphone is. Oh, can you just say it out loud?
I've just emailed everybody a link to the slides.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
So it's without the comics, but you have all the important ones. We'll be going over at least 30 meta-analyses or so, and I'm not going to get caught in the weeds of exactly how many studies, how many patients, and the like. So you have that. So if I'm moving through them, just because I want to extract what's of clinical importance. So as I said, we started this about 30 years ago, and actually it was in response to people keep talking about these evidence-based practices and empirically validated treatments, as though selecting a particular treatment method for a particular problem was going to solve the problem in psychotherapy, that not everyone succeeds. Of course, we now know that was a massive mistake, makes virtually no difference. That's not to say anything goes, but you pick any decent, studied psychotherapy, and with just a few exceptions, it has practically the same results, the so-called dodo bird verdict. So it's not that I'm against treatment methods, we all need to do something, but it's been shown, right? This is no longer, again, opinion, it's just fact. That's not the way to increase psychotherapy success. It's the relationship and it's the fit. So specifically, we wanted to identify first what works in therapy relationships. So if you say the relationships work, what specific parts of the relationship work? So what works in general? Second, we wanted to identify effective methods to tailor, personalize, or responsiveness to the individual patient. What works in particular? And then, honestly, we didn't get this the first time, but the second time, someone said, well, isn't it also important to tell people what doesn't work? And we went, yes, that was pretty stupid of us. So now we talk about identifying ineffective relationship behaviors. It may be equally important to avoid certain things rather than just do others. Okay? So, 20 years ago, we set out to do that. We do it every 10 years. Mick generously characterized this as influential. And indeed, the number of citation counts for the chapters in the books continue to amaze us every year. And I get way too much credit for this. Each of the books has dozens of meta-analyses. Believe me, I did not conduct all of them. As editor, and you keep reading them, it feels like you could have saved time by doing them all yourself. But you'll see the respective authors' names under each of the slides, right? So honestly, it's just not me. So each time we add more and more elements. It's now a 2-volume source, edited by my long-term collaborators, Mike Lambert and Bruce Wampole. Volume 1 is the therapy relationship itself. Volume 2 is personalizing. Okay. By the way, we throw NREP up there, and even though that recently closed, it's a government initiative under SAMHSA. SAMHSA is the System for Mental Health and Addictions in the United States. We mentioned it up here because they had started by saying we are going to identify the treatment methods that work. And many of us were saying, you're starting at the wrong place. And they realized that, which is one of the reasons they shut down, by the way. So we were the first non-treatment method to be included in SAMHSA with the relationships and responsiveness. In part, the manager of the NREP credited us with closing them down, saying it was pretty clear that just identifying a bunch of treatment methods that work is not the way to proceed in psychotherapy research. And it surely isn't. And I think you'll share that conclusion as well when I show you some of these effect sizes. So I know what you're thinking. How do we decide what works? Isn't that pretty damn complicated? It's incredibly complicated. But at the end of the day, here's our evaluation criteria. So we're looking at the number. Remember, you all have these slides. The number of studies, the consistency of the results, the independence. We don't just want to look at it from a single lab. The magnitude of the association. What is the power of these? The evidence for the causal link between the two, and then finally the ecological or external validity. So at this point, everyone's saying, well, this looks pretty reasonable. Maybe we'll learn something. He's not too bad for a yank. And then I have to traumatize you with stats. So I really do apologize. But I guarantee you it will be brief, and this will help you appreciate the power, the magnitude of what we're talking about. So when you conduct a meta-analysis, you need at the end an effect size. And I know many of you kind of remember this. It's a little hazy. You've tried to repress it now, but it's coming back. So usually the effect size is something by a guy named Cohen. Cohen's D, which means D for difference. You can also see Hedges' G. It's virtually identical for our purposes. So the D is simply interpreted like this. Treatment A versus treatment B. If there is no difference, at least in the group outcomes or effectiveness of your patients, there's no difference, that's a 0. There's no difference. If the D is 0.2, that's a small difference, at least in behavioral sciences. If it's a D or G of about 0.5, it is a medium effect. And if it's 0.8, most people believe that is a large effect. For comparison, know that a D of 0.8 to 0.85 is the typical effect size of psychotherapy versus no psychotherapy. Again, that differs on the type of measures you use. Before I die, Mick and I should write an article on how to inflate your effect size. For example, always use the Beck Depression Inventory. That thing floats and changes so quickly. Patients' self-reported symptoms, you get great effect sizes. In fact, the average effect size is over 1 for those. But if you use a personality test or quality of life, from no psychotherapy to psychotherapy, you get like a D of 0.2 or 3. So, right, it's complicated. But anyway, 0.8 is a large, meaningful effect. You would be happy as a therapist. Your patients would love if they could get there all the time. So when we go through these meta-analyses, just keep those in mind, okay? All right, so let's jump in. What works in general? Evidence-based relationships. Sure, we all know the relationship is critical. It's crucial. But if we were to spend a half an hour and each of you had to nominate one thing that worked, we would have a bizarre patchwork of recommended elements of the therapy relationship. I made the mistake of just doing this a couple weeks ago, and the nonsense that was coming out just made me stop. I didn't even get through half the crowd. So people were saying stuff like, I know what really makes the difference. And I said, oh, good. They said nonverbal behaviors. And I went, oh, really not much research on that. Which doesn't mean it doesn't work, right? We just don't know. Someone else said, well, it's trust. And I said, well, you know, I wish we had research on that one, but there's only about 3 studies. Someone looking for a study? Trust is hanging out there. Of course, some people, empathy, alliance, great answers. You're going to find these here. But I think you're also going to be surprised. For instance, people frequently say, I just believe confrontation is what shakes up the patient. And I say, yes, it does shake up the patient. It produces 50% more dropouts and leads to long-term deterioration. And they went, what? I don't believe it. So I said, well, here's the meta-analysis. They said, I still don't believe it. So if you don't believe it, leave now, because that's what's going to happen. So, remember I showed you those evaluation criteria? Again, not to get lost in the weeds, but this is the stuff that demonstrably works. Then we have a bunch that probably work, just not quite as strong. Okay. So, let's go through the demonstrably effective. So as I'm doing this, and you're just thinking, what do I take away here? These are the things to do if you're a practitioner. If you're a teacher, these are the things to ensure that your students learn. And not just read about, but I'm talking about learn. And if you're a supervisor, you want to be tracking these. And if you're a patient, and most of us are simultaneously both practitioner and patient, then make sure your psychotherapist is offering these. So the first is that alliance. The alliance, most people still using Ed Borden's fantastic tripartite definition of the alliance, a warm emotional bond. Patient and therapist agree on their respective goals of treatment, and then there's consensus on the task. What's the therapist to do? What's the patient to do? By the way, I'll mention here and underscore later that the alliance by itself does not constitute the totality of the relationship. In fact, you just saw that a minute ago. Look at all these variables, and there's more that are probably effective. But many people would have you believe if we only look at the alliance, you're looking at the totality of the relationship. That underestimates the power of the relationship. And by the way, it's usually intentional too. They could just say, well, just look at the alliance and this is the power of the relationship. Not even close. The alliance is the most frequently studied, as you'll see in a few moments, but it turns out it's not the most powerful. Good old empathy is still number one. If you had to say, I need one thing from my therapist, it better be empathy. So, for example, this is by Adam Harvath, Bruce Wampole, A.C. Del Rey, Chris Flukinger. They found 306 adult studies representing 30,000 patients. Now, I keep emphasizing that because, occasionally you go to workshops, and certainly I've been to them, where someone says, oh, yeah, well, we did our particular psychotherapy method on 20 patients. We found this, so go home and do this. And I always sit there and think, research your allegiance, 20 people, I don't know this person. This has got 30,000 patients. If you believe anything in psychotherapy research, I'm pretty sure it's something like this. Okay? So what's that median D between alliance and treatment outcome? It's 0.57. So you'll remember our little tutorial on the D, that's a median, but it is an incredibly robust association. And yes, the alliance by itself is a medium effect. But notice 0.57 gets you more than halfway to the total success of psychotherapy. That's incredibly impressive. By the way, when we talk about the effect of treatment methods matched to a particular disorder, the highest you get, the highest ever recorded, is 0.20. So treatment method, highest 0.20. The first element of the relationship, 0.57. By the way, it's equal effects across all psychotherapists. There's similar alliance effects. For those of you who might be doing psychopharmacological treatment, the alliance between the prescriber and the patient is equal. So this isn't just a psychological treatment effect. This really occurs. It's comparable alliance outcome effects for different alliance measures, different research designs, but interestingly, significantly less for substance abusers. So for those of you working there, you know the alliance is important. Just doesn't quite have the power it would in other areas. Alliance just doesn't occur in adults, also occurs in youth. So I know how much time to spend on this. How many of you see adolescents or children? Okay, thank you. Well, then it's worth a moment. So there's an ongoing debate, because as you know, when you're seeing children and adolescents, you actually have two alliances. You have one with the child or youth themselves, and then you have one with the caregiver or the parent. There's been an ongoing dispute which is more powerful. My colleague, Alan Kasdan, a famous child psychologist, always used to argue it was with the parent because he said his 8-year-old patients don't drive themselves to his clinic. I used to say, no, I'm pretty sure it's with the youth, because if the youth won't get in the car and these parents can't control them half the time, then they're not coming either. So we bet a dinner on this meta-analysis by Mark Carver and Steve Shirk and others. So it turns out they show exactly the same association. So no dinner for nobody. So it's 0.4, your relationship, your alliance with the parent-caregiver, and 0.4 with the youth. Okay? So quite powerful. Or as my favorite Joni Mitchell used to sing, so much is said in listening. By the way, the alliance also occurs in CFT. People seeing couples and family here? That makes 3 of us. All right, it works there too. Actually, this kind of blows my mind, the number of alliances. It's the individual with the therapist, the one patient with the other patient, and in families, conjoint families, this patient, this patient, this patient, and each of those with each other and with the therapist. Yeah, I understand nothing about this meta-analysis. I understand multi-level, 3-level meta-analyses. I couldn't understand this. But apparently it works. Mickey Freelander tells me, and I believe her. Okay? So, same thing for couple and family therapy. So this is by Adam Horvath. So there's something incredibly new happening in psychotherapy research. Back when I was in training, you see the little blue ones? We were trained and largely were researching with Carl Rogers' facilitative conditions, right? Empathy, genuineness or congruence, and positive regard. So you can see that was the case. But the last couple years have led to a decrease in people studying that. Instead, the alliance is by far the most popular. So if you're conducting a research and know you cannot possibly assess all these dimensions, use the alliance measures. That's what's happening. So, group therapy. What's the relationship like in group therapy? Well, most people will say it's cohesion. That's the probable parallel of the alliance and individual therapy. This is that stickiness between group members that they find so powerful. Gary Burlingame and his colleagues found 55 studies. By the way, the K means the number of studies. N, the number of patients. 6,000 studies. A D of 0.56 between group cohesion and treatment outcome. So you want to know why group therapy works? It's largely because of cohesion. Not only cohesion, but certainly cohesion. I mentioned earlier that empathy still ranks as #1 in terms of pure power. This is the meta-analysis done by Elliott, that's Robert Elliott, Art Bohart, Jeannie Watson, and the like. Most people still using some variant of Carl Rogers' initial measures, now largely called the Barrett-Lennard Relationship Inventory, and they still adopt, for the most part, Carl Rogers' definition of empathy as the therapist's sensitive understanding of clients' feelings and struggles, importantly, from the client's view. 82 studies, 290 effects, 6,000 patients, a mean AD of 0.58 between empathy and outcome. Now, I love these moderator analyses. Maybe I love them too much. There is a higher effect size for CBT than there is for experiential, humanistic, and psychodynamic therapies. So far from saying, yes, empathy is powerful, but only for you person-centered folks, it turns out empathy, the client's experience of your empathic understanding, is more important if you're doing CBT. And a moment of reflection, I think, makes this pretty clear. If your cognitive behavior therapist is having you doing challenging exposure, homework assignments, and the like, then you better be quite empathic to their experiences. Okay? So empathy, not just for Rogerians. It's even more important for non-Rogerians. Love how that just turns it on its head. So yes, 9% of the total outcome variance, a fancy way for saying if your patients succeed or fail, is due to empathy. By the way, you're probably thinking 9% of 100%. That's not too impressive, but we can't account for 100% of anything. We can't account for 100% of the outcome variance, whether you'll be a good therapist. By the way, we can only account for about 30% of that. As with other meta-analyses, time and time again, friends, we find the same thing. You need to be favoring the client's perspective. Your sensitive guess of what your clients are experiencing are piss poor compared to what the client is experiencing. Yes, write that down. Norcross said it. Piss poor. I know it's a narcissistic insult, it's fine. We're going to work on the ruptures later. So I've already made fun of your lame excuse for the office, and now I'm saying you're not very good at guessing your client's reactions. Okay? Sorry, well, there's two examples. We'll repair. It's also true, by the way. Well, did you ever leave one of your personal therapy sessions and just say, that person really doesn't understand what the hell I'm talking about? But you want to be a good patient, right? So you kind of lead them a little, but they're really not with you. And you say, is it worth it? Well, they're a pretty good person. I guess I'll come back, right? That's just how the world works. And of course, that's nothing compared to our ordinary relationships with friends, partners, and everyone else, right? We're lucky if we're like 50% of the time do they really understand what we're going with. So that's important when we start talking about alliance ruptures. They're ubiquitous. They happen all the time. More than 80% of clients, when asked, was there a moment in your therapy session where there was a strain, a misunderstanding, a breakdown in your alliance? Over 80% of the clients say, oh yeah, every single session. Rachel Riemann, in a lovely book called Kitchen Table Wisdom, writes, listening creates a holy silence. When you listen generously to people, they can hear the truth in themselves, often for the first time. And when you listen deeply, you can know yourself in everyone. It's exactly what occurs in empathy. How about collecting client feedback? This is all the rage in the United States. Is that happening here with the core? And these other people primarily use the core?
Yeah. PHQ 9 and GD7.
Oh, all right. In the States, overwhelmingly, people are using, as you can see on the bottom, there's a dozen or so, but Lambert's outcome questionnaire 45 and Miller and Duncan's free 4-item dominate the research. But it's become such a popular, and actually it's just gravitated, now it's called routine outcome monitoring, rather than collecting outcome. But the process is exactly the same. You inquire directly about a client's progress on a regular basis. You compare those client answers to some benchmark. You provide the feedback immediately to the therapist, who then delivers and discusses that feedback in session. And some of the feedback systems, the ROM or the feedback systems, then provide clinical support tools. Mike Lambert's, for example, when things are not going well, patients are deteriorating or at least not evidencing progress as expected, he gives his clinical support tools include a stage of change measure to see if you've misidentified the patient's stage of change. He gives an alliance measure, and he gives a social support measure. So it's only for patients who are not progressing. Okay. So what happens when you do that? Well, the reason it's all the rage is it tends to be very helpful. But what most people don't want to tell you is that there's quite modest utility when used with all patients. Mike Lambert devised his client feedback for patients who were not progressing well. That is, for patients at risk for failure. And for those patients, doing routine outcome management or so-called client feedback works magnificently. Okay? You'll see that in the next slide. But giving it to all patients every session makes very little sense. I don't know what the hell people are doing. In fact, my patients would say, because I'm a geek, right? So Mike very nicely gave me his proprietary software, because you have to purchase the OQ. It's a private software. So Mike gave it to me as a colleague and as a friend. When I tried to use it every session, they would just look at me and say, didn't I just take this last week? I said, I did just give it to you last week, but I'm tracking your progress. And I tried to use Mike's favorite images and metaphors. This is like going to your physician. This is like your vital signs. This is like your blood pressure. This is your lab work. And they would say, I don't get lab work every week. What the hell are you doing? All right, so then I used the shorter one. Again, it helps just to be friends. like with Scott Miller's got his great PCOM system, Partner Change Management. 4 little items, which is now also software. By the way, this is free if you're interested in those items. So I use those, and they just said, please stop, I'll tell you if something's wrong, okay? So it is just incredibly insensitive when things are going well to just keep giving instruments to see how people are doing. When they're going well, it's when things aren't going well that routine outcome management or feedback is really quite helpful. Here's the other little secret. I should be careful because he is videotaping. So it's a dirty little secret. There's absolutely no evidence that using paper measures works any better than just asking your patients. The important part is you ask. And people say, I played with all these measures, including the core, and it's like, nah. You just have to ask 3 little questions. How are you doing, right, in terms of their symptoms, their goals, or whatever? How's our treatment going? You want anything more or less different? And how are we doing? You know, the relationship question. That's it. You ask those 3 questions, you get everything you need. But the world likes measures. And the feedback for at-risk patients, friends, is really quite impressive. So collecting feedback reduces deterioration rates from an average of 30% in non-progressing clients to 12%. By the way, that's the percent of patients in most clinics who are not progressing as expected. That doesn't mean they've necessarily dropped out, but it means they're not progressing in their therapy. So think about this. You can reduce the chances of at-risk patients experiencing deterioration. You can reduce that by half by asking the questions or giving the measures. Okay? That's very impressive. So that's why we say this is demonstrably effective for patients at risk. If your patients are not doing well, then you're going to do something like routine outcome management. You can give instruments, you can ask questions. The real problem, by the way, and I know many of you are trainees, is not taking it personal. Thinking that the data is always friendly and that you honestly want to know. But since you're also being evaluated and your self-esteem is involved, it's difficult to turn to a patient and say, you know, we're in session 7, and from what you're saying and the measures tell me, we really haven't seen any progress, right? It's very difficult to do, admittedly. But as you'll see, it works. So the power and the particular value of feedback is identifying non-responders and doing something about them. Half of the people will no longer drop out. You won't be surprised by this next one, goal consensus and collaboration, frequently but not necessarily part of the alliance. Some alliance measures have these as part of them, but you can see when you're literally on the same page with patients, things work well. D of 0.49, 0.61, 0.54, again accounting for 9% of the outcome variance. Good stuff. So when people say, let's talk about assessing the alliance, that's the obvious power of doing that. Now we turn to a second of Carl Rogers' core facilitative conditions, positive regard, and we phrase this a little larger in the meta-analysis to include some of the newer therapies such as DBT and their validation strategies or affirmation. Here Barry Farber and colleagues located 64 studies, finding a small to medium effect. You'll notice the 3rd bullet point again. The patient's rating of their experience of your positive regard is by far the best predictor. In fact, you predicting how well the patient feels affirmed or supported is, I don't want to create a third rupture. It's not very strong. Let's just put it that way. Okay? I won't call it useless, but now you're guessing of how much support your patients receive. As Winnie the Pooh's anticipated this phenomenon of internalization, if there ever comes a day when we can't be together, keep me in your heart, I'll stay there forever. And those of you who've had the privilege of seeing enough patients over the years know this is exactly the way it works. People say, you're on my shoulder, you're in my head, I think of you, the words come back, sometimes it's in my voice, in your voice. This is exactly what occurs. So that's the demonstrably effective. Now I'm going to zoom through some probably effective elements. And some of these may not be known to you. These include the real relationship, facilitating emotional expression. By the way, both new to the most recent sets of analyses. And some oldies but goodies. Congruence, repairing alliance ruptures. By the way, repairing alliance ruptures, it's just growing so many. If we were to do the meta-analysis today, it would be demonstrably effective. Managing countertransference, promoting treatment credibility, and cultivating positive expectations. I want to remind you as I zoom through these, you have the slides, right? So we're just hitting the highlights. Many people, unless they're trained in the psychodynamic tradition, are unfamiliar with the real relationship. So Freud said not every relationship between an analyst and his subject is transference. There's also friendly relationships based on reality. That's why it's called real relationships. Or in the understatement of the millennium, Anna Freud said, patient and analyst are two real people of equal status. I wonder whether our complete neglect of this matter is not responsible for some of the hostile reactions we get from our patients. You think? Okay. So, when we say real relationship, think realism and genuineness had a baby, and that's real relationship. Okay? So what happens? You find 17 studies. It reveals the highest effect size. So we've already seen this for genuineness. Now it's realism. So in contrast to some of my psychoanalytic colleagues saying you should not be emphasizing the real relationship, it turns out, yes, you should be emphasizing the real relationship. Not instead of transference, but in addition to transference. There's real stuff happening. And COVID, by the way, has brought this home. Can you imagine someone saying you seem to have some difficulty with being on the screen? What's that, a transferential element? No, we're staring at people on screens. Of course, it's a real problem. By the way, and this one excites me quite a bit, emotional expression. If I had asked any of you, do you think some emotion in sessions help? You would say, hell yes, but we just didn't know this in an empirical sense. So, there's a D of 0.56 between your experience of some emotion in session and your patients getting well. And client affective experience is correlated even higher with them getting well. So, to be sure, not all sessions have fireworks, great drama, great emotional cathartic reactions, but you need a little emotion. Okay? By the way, any teacher would know that, right? Yeah, the dry stuff is just losing most people. In fact, I'm amazed most of you are still with me. By the way, I always say, yeah, remember, these are correlations. We get to causation later, but you can still be excited. Emotion, yes. Congruence, genuineness, arguably the most fundamental Rogers facilitated conditions. And in my favorite, third bullet, higher effect sizes for congruence are obtained for older, licensed, more experienced therapists. Mick and I got this going here. Okay. There's probably a bunch of things that younger people are doing better, but here you go, we got this. I'll remind you, we're coming back to repairing alliance ruptures, but I'll quickly hit the research here. As I said, most patients experience a breakdown in the alliance, but most do not tell us about ruptures unless asked. In fact, if they keep complaining to us without being asked, we diagnose them as borderline personality. Yes. But when you do invite them with a genuine openness to their experience, patients will tell you. It's really quite impressive. So in 11 studies, Catherine Eubanks, Chris Moran, and the late Jeremy Safran found the relation of rupture repair episodes, that's what we're going to practice in a few minutes, with treatment outcome is 0.62. That's a good effect size. Remember, psychotherapy versus non-psychotherapy, 0.8, 0.85, 0.62, repairing ruptures. Very good. By the way, the other reason I like to teach this, is my colleagues are some of the first and only still to investigate whether offering training in this makes a difference. By the way, it's kind of ironic, right? Do we know whether I tried to teach you empathy makes a difference with your patients? Do we even know you can actually learn it? Man, right, a little bit. They actually wanted to know, is it worth their time teaching people how to do this? And indeed, yes, versus no training at all. So, what you're going to learn today, guaranteed to work. Managing countertransference. Yes, research has called out to practice. You should not take your personal shit out on patients. It's right here. Okay, good science. It says right there, 14 studies. There's a negative correlation between you experiencing, and by the way, in this meta-analysis, countertransference is the old nasty stuff, not the newer definition. Old bad stuff you're experiencing. That actually hurts your patients. By contrast, if you can manage your countertransference, that is, control it, then your patients get better. Okay. So, when your supervisors and your teachers are talking about you're having a difficult personal time, COVID, relationships, physical illness, it is important to do this, right? And I mean in an empirical sense, right? The research says this will help your patients. Promoting treatment credibility. This is the patient's cognitive evaluation to which a treatment appears suitable and effective. By the way, virtually no studies on therapist credibility. Someone else looking for study? There it is. They're always looking at whether they think the treatment works instead of the therapist. Cultivating positive expectations. You know this works. But there's virtually no good controlled research on this anymore. There's another study for someone. Just not correlating, right? So if you go in expecting better things, you usually get better things. We know that, right? So you want to cultivate your patient's expectations, but we're not doing enough on how to do that. In fact, all the studies are fascinating, right? Charge a little more, you look better. Put up, and this is one of my all-time favorite studies, between 5 and 7 diplomas in your office, you get credibility. Less than 5, lower credibility. More than 7, lower credibility, you narcissist. Yes, 5 to 7 is the magic number. Who knew? By the way, been replicated too. Actually, I read that. You might need to put one out. I never had one up in the office. All right, self-disclosure and immediacy. So what you need to know here is we call these promising because there's not enough good research on them. Virtually all the studies are analog studies. By contrast, everything I just reviewed, they have to be actual patients, real psychological treatment. No analog studies. There's lots of analog studies on self-disclosure. And the take-home here is self-disclose about half as much as you think is effective. Most therapists are self-disclosing way too much. So we're using the term judiciously, which for most of you should be less than you're doing now. Okay? It is one of the highest complaints of patients when you say, what don't you like about your therapist? In fact, I remember Mick, we asked, what was that? We did some, like a couple thousand people for free one time, and we just decided on the spur of the moment, type in what your pet peeve of your therapist was. Now, there were some interesting idiosyncratic ones, like one, she wore too much jewelry, and the other person, the one that sticks out was, I hated when my therapist had toenail fungus and wore sandals without socks. And I was like, who comes up with this stuff? But the number one was they just kept talking about themselves. That's what the research shows. It's not your session. And I think, by the way, COVID has made this worse. Every postdoc I have, every psychiatry resident I'm supervising, as soon as a patient talks about COVID, My supervisees want to talk about their experience with COVID. I'm just going to put an apple in it. Come on, it's not your session. Okay? Now, the good news is, when you do it well, disclosure works particularly well when clients are feeling alone, vulnerable, in need of support. And immediacy, especially when problems encountered in the treatment relationship, such as we discussed in a moment, rupture repair. So they certainly have their moments, but a little less disclosure would go a long way. Okay? Whew. So amidst this tsunami of meta-analyses, you might be asking, are there others? Of course there are. We've not completed the search, we've not exhausted the relationship behaviors, but if there's not sufficient research studies, there's nothing to compile, right? So we can only analyze what's there. So trust, deliberate practice, credibility, humor, we just don't know. That's not to say they don't work, it's just we don't know, at least in the research sense. One of my pet peeves, see, I'm now self-disclosing way too much. One of my pet peeves is you attend a workshop and no one ever tells you the damn limitations. So here they are. Content overlap among these elements. I presented them as separately, but they're highly correlated. The alliance and empathy correlated 0.4, 0.5. All the Rogerian, the 3 core facilitative conditions, correlated highly, anywhere from 0.3 to 0.6, depending upon the study. So it's not as though we can just simply add up the effect sizes, right? Because they're heavily intercorrelated. Training to competence in these relationships remains spotty. So we frequently teach them. We have students nod and we say, yes, I'm going to do my best Carl Rogers forward lean and ahas, but are we really teaching people the competence? No, we typically teach them to the end of the semester. Okay? So we need to do a little better about that. I haven't said much about the patient's contribution to the relationship. And of course, it's a relationship. I'm largely talking about the therapist's contribution. And from a research perspective, we're always concerned about the M&M question. Are these therapy relationship elements a mechanism of change? Are they a moderator of change, perhaps even a mediator of change? The problem is these are largely correlations. I say except the alliance and feedback, because those we've been able to have some randomized clinical trials. So the first part of today's workshop is correlational. Now let me just say about this, if I might. Here's one of those rampant self-disclosures that annoy stations. When people say, it's all correlational, John, I say, yes, that's a research problem. It is. And I say, but you know what? I've come to think quite differently about this. The fact that we cannot ethically randomize clients to some of these elements may suggest that they are precious and even more powerful. So here's an example. Most of you probably tried to love your children. I'm guessing. Do you know there's not a single randomized clinical trial that shows loving your children produces better kids? Think about that for a minute. Right? Ethically, we can't take 10, as J.B. Watson once proposed, right? We can't take 10 kids and give them to loving parents and then give the other 10 and randomize them to unloving parents, right? So if you're loving your kids, you're really not doing evidence-based practice then, are you? There's no randomized clinical trial. Well, it's the same thing like this. Would I love to randomize some patients to low alliance, poor empathic, excessively self-disclosing therapists and see what happens? You bet I would. That would never get through a research board. Not even close, right? Not even on one of those dimensions. So the fact we can't randomize it is in many ways an implicit acknowledgement that this is the precious and the powerful stuff. You can't even randomize. So we do know what works. All these effect sizes, remember, concretely translate into healthier and happier people. But of course, it's not the only thing that works. So let's take a moment. There, by the way, the funky Dwight and the other one. Take a few questions. Comments, arguments are good too.
got roving mic.
Hi, Dr. Norcross. Thank you for a great presentation. I've been in private practice for about 5 years, and I see about 30 to 35 clients a week, and I have a very low dropout rate these days. Confrontation is the one thing that I disagree with you on.
What is it?
Confrontation.
Confrontation.
Because it typically...
Can I anticipate this?
Okay.
There's style and then there's content. What is discredited is the style, not the content.
Okay.
Does that stop you?
Yeah.
Good. That was close, man. End of the first hour is about to be taken out. As soon as I said that, I said, you know, anyone who's listening to me say, well, wait a minute, are you just blowing sunshine up your patients' asses? This is not what we're supposed to be doing. So surely the content, but it's the style of confrontation. So think like Zeus on Mount Olympia, throwing thunderbolts down at humans, saying, I am a god, you are a nothing patient. It is that style that is contraindicated. Patients indeed need clarifying feedback, identification of problems, hearing stuff that other people just won't tell. But it's how we do it that is discredited.
Because you get clients that they're in conflict. It takes a few sessions just to realise that they're in conflict with everyone in their life.
Yes.
And in the session, they're very kind of argumentative.
And particularly when they have a personality disorder, other people just avoid them to get away from them, which I don't mind. And, you know, they usually have like 3 or 4 ex-spouses who will tell you the same thing. So literally, no one's ever said to them, you know, you act like an asshole. But can you get them to say, I act like an asshole, and then they buy it, and then it works?
You've been waiting 3 years for that, that's the problem.
Yes.
And that's where emotional engagement comes in, disclosing your own feelings about that when the relationship.
Well, in fact, that we'll see is essentially repairing the rupture. So that's fine, saying when you have a concrete referent, when we say, you know, I notice when I say this, you get a little surly and angry with me. Can you tell me more about that experience? That's exactly what they need. But that's not confrontation. In fact, that's called motivational interviewing. So we agree. They need content. They need that realistic feedback that other people aren't giving. It's the way it's done that's discredited. One down.
Hey John, I suppose one of my reflections on looking at some mixed data is it's quite hard to get like negative feedback from clients, but they don't say the therapist is like bad or whatever. So I don't know how the research methodology moves that forwards. Don't have any thoughts about that.
Well, first let me address it clinically. One can get negative. So, for example, on the session rating scale by Miller and Duncan, there's a 10-point scale. The average rating is a 7.5 rating. So if you want to feel good about yourself, go ahead and use that. But because of social desirability and people just pushing, it's overwhelmingly. In fact, Scott says if you're not getting 8s and 9s, you're in trouble. And I keep saying, well, that just makes no sense from a measurement perspective. And he says, well, it's just the way people are. So clinically, if you say, I'm really interested in your experience, I know maybe your mom said if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. That's not the case here. This is valuable. This is your life, your future involved. So I honestly need you to tell me what's experiencing. Once you open that up, then people will tell you. From a research perspective, though, it is a mess, and it creates such a ceiling effect that the correlations are almost meaningless. So if everyone's something like, 90% of patients completing these forms are giving 8, 9s, and 10s, the correlations are close to spurious. It's a real research problem. But clinically, you don't have that the moment you say, this is collaboration, this is how we need to work together. That's a great question.
From here, and then we'll take another couple.
Yeah, and then we'll have to move on.
Thank you. I'm interested whether there is a sort of gender element that you've noticed. I'm assuming, I don't know this, that a lot of the research is actually sort of not gender neutral. You know, there's a majority of women, perhaps, as therapists being looked at. So I'm interested in that aspect.
They are indeed. In the United States, cross studies, about 2/3 of the patients are women, about 65%, probably here too. Majority women anyway? Yes. So on each of these meta-analyses, the authors have to conduct a series of moderator analyses, seeing if there is a systematic difference, for example, between female and male patients, and there almost never is on anything I've just shown you. After the break, I'll be showing you stuff about gender accommodative and gender empowering, and then you'll see exactly how that works, but not on these meta-analyses. No differences.
And I'm just sort of following on from the last two questions. I was thinking that there's probably considerable cultural difference. If you ask those questions in Japan or Britain, it's probably very different from the responses you would get in New York or Chicago.
You will indeed. So here's an example. When Mike Lampert and I were over in Asia giving a series of talks about ROM, the routine outcome management, they said no patient is ever going to say to a therapist in Japan, here's what I need. So we had to come up with a way we're doing this. As it turns out, they were all willing to write it down, fold it, and pass it to the therapist. Even though we were still the same two people right here, but writing it and passing it. So it makes a huge difference. Mixing my research and others on preferences finds that the same way. In fact, just this last week, we got a manuscript from, why did he say it's called, what's his name besides Strong? You don't know either. We have a colleague who has restandardized the preferences, and they all moved. And it's been restandardized for Italy and the like. So we tell people you can use the items, but it has to be restandardized. The people, again, in Japan and China, wanted way more directive advice than US and UK population would. Yeah, so it's all culturally embedded. In fact, how you experience empathy will vary person to person, of course, but also just culture to culture. That's just a given. You don't know his name. I don't know either. All right. How about we practice some? Repairing alliance ruptures. I'll come back to the other one. I love it. It's the best part of my presentation. No one's going to argue? Tough audience. I shouldn't have started by messing with the office. I just knew. So, a rupture is a deterioration in the alliance manifested by, and you'll remember Ed Borden's tripartite definition. So we have the warm emotional bond, we have therapy tasks that we agree on, and then there's the goals, what is to be done. So any kind of strain, rupture, or weakness can lead to this rupture. Okay? You'll also recall that I've already said over 80% of patients in any session will have one of these strains. There's 2 or 3 types. In fairness, the creators of this system largely keep talking about 2, and I keep saying I've never seen a pure type in my life. They just sort of say, well, there's a mixed type too. And I keep saying, well, it seems to be the majority of people. So it's 2 or 3. But withdrawal, in which you move away from the therapist and the work. So what might be a withdrawal rupture? Just throw out some ideas. A patient would do what?
Go silent.
What?
Go silent.
Go silent. And a withdrawing, so not like I'm processing. Right. Thank you.
DNA did not arrive.
Well, a no-show is one way of avoiding it completely. Yes.
Doorknob whispers, John.
Don't what?
Doorknob whispers, where they tell you something really, really relevant on the way out.
Oh, yeah, the hand nod. Oh, yeah, by the way, I'm getting divorced. I've had 2 patients do that on the way out. And then, right, you got patients waiting, and it's always, when they do that, I just say, let us take a moment and agree we're not going to do that again, right? And then you have the confrontation. So some examples about that.
A 13-year-old, and I feel like I've gone 12 rounds with Tyson.
There you go. So specifically, what kind of stuff did they do?
Oh, well, there's something wrong with my brain. It's not anxiety. It can't be. And, what you said there, that's baloney. And, well, that isn't true.
So they reject the treatment. They doubt the credibility of the therapist. They disagree with you everything. You're on my parents' side. So all of those would be from a child. Someone says, I'm not getting well. That may be a statement of understandable fact, but it may also be a bludgeon against the therapist. The classic, I'm paying you lots of money. It takes me an hour to get here, and you just repeat to me what I just said to you, right? I mean, they can say any of that. Or your interpretation was absolutely wrong, okay? Or your joke about the office was insensitive, right? Or what's this narcissistic insult? I know what my patients are experiencing, John. Don't you dare tell me, okay? So the next part then is the repair. When the dyad, and here we're just practicing individual, it certainly can be used in couples. When the dyad resumes collaborating on the work, right? Tasks, goals, with a warm emotional bond. So rupture occurs of a withdrawal, confrontation type, sometimes mixed, and then we hope to repair it. Okay? So you got most of the withdrawal, rupture markers. By the way, Catherine Eubanks has a free called 3RS, if you're particularly interested in this, the Rupture Resolution Rating Scale. Patients deny, minimal response, silence, avoidant storytelling, which I hadn't thought of, by the way, when I first heard this, but yes. Overly deferential, or just feeling hopeless, not specifically related to their depression. Confrontation ruptures, complaints, rejects interventions, concerns about activity, defends self against the therapist, and sometimes efforts to control the therapist, which certainly your adolescent was. Well, not just control, beat you senseless, right? So if you reflect on your clinical experience, your own personal therapy and intimate relationships, this is the way to begin thinking about rupture repairs. We all regularly experience weakening, strains, and threats in our close relationships. Okay? If we had a social psychologist or anyone doing relationship work, they would say, it's only 80% in therapy? Jesus. It's 100% in any given day between intimate partners and parents. Right? There's always some strain going on. So it's only 80% in therapy sessions. The research is very clear. Most patients do not tell us about ruptures unless asked. Now that's the important caveat, unless asked. So we'll be asking. Ruptures are frequently ignored or immediately forgiven in strong relationships. So just think, a close friend, an intimate partner, a child, whatever. They just said something just slightly off. They didn't understand you, they minimized it. Again, a bad joke. You went out of your way to get them a coffee, they'd say thank you. That may have been a personal example from me this morning. And by the way, she does say thank you about 98% of the time. So I was just like, whoa, what is that? But if it's a strong relationship, you just let it go, right? It's not like you have to address it every time, because it's just an inherent part of life. So in strong relationships, it goes. But we know in therapy, if these are important, if they're potent, then we better repair the ruptures, because it increases treatment success and it reduces dropouts. This is the same slide you saw earlier, just to remind you. Relation to rupture repair episodes with treatment outcome, 0.62. So when you identify an important rupture in session and you repair it in session, look at how much better things are going to go. Okay. And it does reduce dropout. Now, fair warning for those of you in training, ruptures can evoke feelings of confusion, ambivalence, and guilt in therapists. My colleagues, Chris Moran and the late Jeremy Safran, believe, that's why I put probably, it's the number one reason ruptures are ignored in session. We don't like to deal with it. You're a helping person, therapy's going in, so why rock the boat? Why would you mention this? Well, because if you don't, it is a prime predictor of premature dropout and worse outcomes. Okay? Fortunately, the research, and largely been done by these three colleagues, points to the general methods of repair. And yes, you're going to say, wow, 7 steps? Yeah, and the 5th one is really should have 19 sub. But let's just go through it. So using my example of saying the American sitcom Office was the funny one. Okay? By the way, do people like your office over here? Well, it's supposed to make you feel awful, right? Every time you watch it, you say, right? But did people like it? Not really? All right, see, he loves it. Mick loves it. There you go. So, my first step was to identify tentatively the rupture with a concrete reference. So I would say, you know, Mick, it appears when I made that super funny joke about the office, you kind of cringed a little and moved away a bit. I'm wondering, what's your experience of that? So that's number 2, right? I invite the patient to share their experience. And he would say,
I was a bit offended.
So
my British sensibilities were a bit offended.
There you go. So then I respond non-defensively. You know what I want to say. It was just a joke. You want to respond defensively and say, get a life? Come on. You don't, you respond empathically. Well, you come in for therapy, and then I'm trying to be a little humorous. I end up offending your sensibility and hurting our relationship. You'll notice it says, perhaps acknowledge the reality of the therapist's contribution. Now, sometimes the therapist's contribution is so blatant, we should be apologizing. You're going to say this didn't happen? You know, I'm supervising a fair number of psychiatry residents that at least once or twice a week have to do the ER, so they're on a 24-hour call. So it's not unusual for them to fall asleep occasionally in sessions. He indeed fell asleep. I'm watching the videotape. I look at him, he looks at me and says, do you think I should admit it? I said, the patient knew it, I knew it, you knew it. You better say, I'm so sorry, it's not you, I had a long night. And you probably should not just say long night, right? Like you're drinking. You know, sorry, I was on call. We had several emergencies. I assure you it's not you, that's not why you're coming here. So in that case, I would apologize. But of course, it was an intentional slight, so we could work on this. So you'll notice then I attend directly to the therapy relationship. You come here to be helped and understood, and instead I insult or offend. I would probably use Mick's word that his sensibilities was somewhat offended. So number 5 is the difficult one, and in truth, the research doesn't help you here. So this is where, friends, you're going to use your theoretical model. So you could perhaps adjust your behavior. So in this instance, I would say, I promise to refrain from such hilarious jokes. See, I'm still blaming the patient. You see how easy that is? I'd say, and if that happens again, I hope you would call me on that, because that's the kind of relationship we want. Or you could clarify. For example, someone can come in and say, you know, that homework assignment made me feel worse. And the therapist may realize, well, that's what exposure does in the short run. So they may clarify your treatment rationale. Or if you're more in a relational dynamic mode, you may interpret that as a transference enactment or a countertransference enactment. So that's, again, why we can't quite tell you what's going to go there. Or perhaps here's another example to you personalizing the world out to get you at a cognitive or interpersonal model. So in fact, the people who have done the most research immediately say, we can't tell you what to do here. You need to know through judgment and your model. Thereafter, we congratulate the client on their honesty. Thank you. You know, it's difficult to tell someone you're working with that that was an insensitive joke. So I appreciate that, and that is the kind of collaboration and honesty we need here. So I always call this a little teaching moment, a little psychoeducation, and I always, just because I do work in another healthcare system, and say, and that is the problem with most healthcare. It's unidirectional. So this is really the power and magic of psychotherapy, that you're collaborating and telling me what helps and what hurt, right? So just a little quick thing there, not a huge lecture. And then in a subsequent session, so maybe the next session, or I would say, well, how does that feel that are we done with that now? Do you feel we should talk more?
It's okay.
It's okay. Let it go, please. By the way, you can't see it, but Mick is misting up. All right. It's a wonderful, warm feeling when someone pays attention to us, isn't it? Yes. I would probably begin the next session then saying, let's talk about that. How are you feeling first about what occurred, and then have you been able to deal with this? Now, if you are more relational, you'll be saying, John, this is nothing new. This is like good therapy. And I'll say, yes, it's a good therapy, but we can now do it a little more systematically and efficiently. And if you weren't trained in relational psychodynamic, you're like, you blow my mind, John. What the hell are you talking about? And indeed, Catherine Eubank has a study showing this training is way more powerful for non-psychodynamic relational people. Because they have literally, and they use the word literally correctly here, not like most of our students walking around saying literally all the time. Literally, they've never seen or been taught this. Okay? So let's break up into dyads. Patient, therapist. Patient, try one confrontation with confrontation rupture. I'll go back in a moment to remind you of those. And then try one withdrawal. Then we'll leave this up and just work through this. So just to remind you, the withdrawal ruptures: denial, minimal response, silence, avoidance, storytelling, overly deferential, hopeless. The confrontation: complaints, rejections, concerns about treatment activities, controlling therapists. Okay? And so you do a confrontation and a withdrawal, try to follow the 7, and then just switch over. So I'm guessing 10 minutes. I do genuinely want to spend a few minutes processing this, but yes, our break is waiting. So hear both sides of it. It's like a double reflection. On the one hand, I can spend hours talking about this with you. On the other hand, your coffee's waiting. Okay. So how did that go?
I think it just feels a bit false because you start having responses much quicker than I actually would with the person in therapy. Because we're going to work through how we would do this.
Yes,
So
and you have a task right here.
Yeah.
Indeed. And you knew it was coming.
Yeah.
Whereas frequently in therapy, you're just moving along and bang, there it is. So to be sure, artificial.
I think it can take a really long time, especially if it's a reflection of whether there's larger interpersonal patterns. And I think in our example, the person was so deep in, really, really stuck in that pain of the process that to step outside of it and that collect the feedback just wasn't, might not be possible to do in the session.
Yes, did people hear that? Doing this with just a quick apology from the therapist acknowledging whatever it was, like me saying that was an insensitive joke, should take about 5 minutes. The moment, though, you go to number 5 and say, this seems reflective of a broader cognitive schema, we're repeating loops from relationships, this is transfers, that hours, right? And indeed, that's what people will say retrospectively. this was a high mark of their therapy, a rupture repair. Someone listened to me, someone understood me, and tried to take a corrective action. So those of you who know the research on retrospective recalls of the good moments in therapy, rupture repair is almost always number one.
It feels very deliberate. It's almost like you have to search for the empathy because you're thinking about how to respond to a rupture. So it takes over, really. It takes presence within the relationship.
Yes, in both a wonderfully positive way and a wonderfully negative way. If you get into your own self-esteem, what did I do wrong, and now I'm being questioned or criticized, I can't tell you how many of my trainees say, I should just drop out of training completely. And I say, no, it's not only the courageous client who does this, it's the courageous therapist who does this. Because it can be painful to sit and have someone say it's not working, or that was stupid. And you're trying to say, well, that's my best joke. And I got nothing left to make now in terms of humor. But when it happens in a relationship, it is powerful for everyone.
One of the points I made with my associate John was that you try to commence, and I've underlined the word commence, working on that rupture straight away, because you don't want that client going off for 7 days of fester with a dropout date.
So in a slide we didn't get to yet, when I discredited relationship behaviors is exactly that. Trainees frequently do an ostrich behavior. That is, they hope against hope this will just go away, and they kind of stick their head in the sand. And yes, I know that really doesn't happen for ostriches. But there's sort of a avoidant mechanism, which is only natural, right? You want to avoid the pain, and maybe they'll forget that incident. No, you do it immediately. That's what the research says. You step right on it and say, I know this can be difficult for both of us, but something happened here. It seemed, could we talk about what your experience of that was? You do not let it fester.
Thank you. While you were talking, I was just wondering if the client have the language to say the words, to say things they want to say, because I find it quite difficult. I have to search within me, kind of like you have to use my therapeutic knowledge and other things to express some of the things I want to express. But at the same time, clients come with maybe their first sessions and they need lots of words. Is there any way kind of we can give?
Well, we in fact love when this happens in an early session, because now you're demonstrating the collaborative nature of psychotherapy and how it's that shared decision making moving forward. But they usually will not have the language for it, and it's enough to just punctuate the moment that something happened. Maybe neither of us quite understand completely what happened. And is it okay if we come back and talk about it? And then that happens. And in subsequent sessions, as they begin to trust you and develop the vocabulary of therapy, and particularly, not to beat on men here, but we know there's a fair number of alexithymic men who can't quite get the feeling stuff out. It takes 3 or 4 sessions to come back to that and talk about it. Yes. Yes.
Would you tend to withdraw a rupture differently to confrontation ruptures?
So it turns out neither I nor my colleagues have good research on that. The only research is when someone's beating you in the head, like Mike Tyson, as you say, we can all agree something was happening there, right? You seem dissatisfied. In fact, I can imagine an adolescent saying, "You think so? I just insulted you 14 times." Whereas the withdrawal, there's more reticence for them to admit it, and it's harder for you to pinpoint it. So if you say, well, you just don't seem quite as engaged in the work and you've got a little more quiet, they just say, like this. And you don't have the obvious concrete referent to touch it. So that seems to be the big difference, but they say the process should be the same. Yes. Do you have another thought? No. Last comment, then we'll take our break.
I was just really interested that you were saying, well, it can take 3 or 4 sessions. I'm working in an HS setting, and my clients are of the it's made me focus on this a lot more because I'm really aware of the time.
Yes.
And it's like, I can't leave this because I've only got 6 sessions. And it really
Well, commence is a good word. The late Jeremy Saffron used to say he pounces on it. And I said, that's a little aggressive imagery for some of us. And he said, well, think of it like you're a friendly cat playing with yarn. I said, fine, then let's use the word pounce when we used to present together. But yes, you're right on it, because you don't have that time. And the same thing with any alliance rupture. In 6 sessions, it needs to be established. Most of the research looks at the quality of the alliance by the 3rd session. But all my friends doing very time-limited stuff says, no, it's in the first 10 minutes. I don't know what you researchers are talking about. I only have 3 sessions. And increasingly in the United States, we're doing lots of bedside consultations. So it could be maybe the very first joke. Yeah. So is another example of annoying over self-disclosure and cultural differences. I realized that our entire time together is 3 hours, inclusive of the break. In the United States, if they say 3 hours, you don't get no friggin' break. You want 3 hours, you stay for 3 hours. So as a result, I have over-prepared. So if I run through some of these very quickly, my apologies. For example, I would usually spend about 5 or 10 minutes on this. I'm going to see if I can do it in 53 seconds. I just made up 53. And I'm going to prioritize, again, because you have some of the slides, I'm going to move quickly to make sure we get to stages of change and reactance level, right? Because that's the practical stuff. But also what's practical is what does not work. So far today, we've concerned ourselves with what does work, according to the research, and compellingly so, at least in my estimation. But translational research should show us, of course, what works, but also what does not work. And that means there are some discredited relationships. So we will progress clinically by simultaneously using what works and avoiding what does not work. So sometimes we call this psycho-quackery. Psych-quack. It cost me $600 for a graphic design with Jerry Kucher, so thank you. But actually now I'm missing nothing. But it requires some consensus, because we simply don't have enough good research on what doesn't work. I mean, right? Can you imagine doing a randomized clinical trial, spending 3 years of your life, 100,000 pounds, to say, oh, this doesn't work, right? No one does that stuff. So instead, we had to do a series of literature reviews and Delphi polls. Now, in truth, we could reverse what does work. So I just told you empathy powerfully works. So you should have unempathic therapists. Collaboration works. So therefore authoritarian would not usually work. Support works, or validation, so non-supportive. But we wanted to do more than just reverse what works. So we conducted these studies, and here's our list of what both experts and research agree does not work. So we've already visited confrontations. You'll see here it says style, not content. So we're not asking or encouraging anyone not to provide some corrective, negative feedback, skills training, and the like to patients. It's the way one does it. So think of motivational interviewing. You express empathy. You develop discrepancy between what the patient's doing and their goals. You roll with their resistance in trying to get places, right? That's the kind of style that we like, not the confrontive style. So I hope that clarifies. Frequent interpretations. Study after study, including a new meta-analysis that I am involved with Clara Hill, shows that frequent interpretations, particularly transference interpretations, hurt patients. This is a real change. I was originally trained in a relational psychodynamic perspective in which we aimed for at least 2 transference interpretations per sessions. right? Patient, therapist, caregiver, right? It was the royal triangle, we used to call it. We now find out that was a serious mistake. The research is quite clear. You should minimize the number of transference interpretations and instead emphasize the quality and experience nearness defined by the client's reception to it. In the category of you already know that, but we know that every research study converges in saying we have to be careful about hostile, pejorative, rejecting, and blaming criticisms. What's particularly important here is those of you, for example, cognitive therapists who repeatedly attack a patient's maladaptive thinking, you need to repeatedly distinguish between attacking the thoughts and attacking the person. We may think it's very clear because we've been doing this for years. Patients frequently miss it. They feel relentlessly attacked. Same thing with transference interpretations. People feel like they're being blamed, when in fact, done well, it's a very empathic. You've been in a relationship for all these years in which you've grown to think and feel this way, so it's only natural you would be responding that way. Versus, don't treat me like your mom, right? Huge difference. Assumptions. Psychotherapists who attempt to intuit or assume how their patients experience the relationship or treatment success are frequently wrong. By the way, there's lots of research on this. This was just not John's narcissistic insult. By contrast, psychotherapists who specifically and respectfully inquire about their patients' experiences tend to have much better outcome. That was the impetus, by the way, for Mike Lambert starting his outcome questionnaire. He kept finding that he didn't know what his patients were experiencing, nor did his students know what their clients were experiencing, but ironically, they were confident they did know. So a little more humility there. Therapist centricity. Again, it's not what you think your patient is experiencing, but what they are experiencing. So you need to privilege that. That can be with forms, that can be with questions, but the therapist's prediction of dropout, by the way, is terrible, insensitive. We really have a difficult time predicting. But if you collect routine outcome management, or any type of feedback really, you can do it. So it's not your experience of that, it's their experience, right? Privilege the client. And finally, I've already talked about ostrich behavior. Regarding early ruptures, I take the trainees, they just hope the bad news goes away, and magically their clients won't think about it. Well, magically, a lot of those clients just don't come back. Okay. So, pounce on it, or commence on it, or address it quickly, however image works for you. Okay. So that's what doesn't work. So if you're a practitioner, don't do this shit. If you are a teacher, don't teach this shit. Supervisors, monitor this shit. There's $600. I'm in the wrong field. All right, so here we are, as promised, personalizing. And I am going to run through this very quickly. I promise again, you have the slides so we can get to the skill exercises. By the way, they love this in New York. I'm curious what you think about this. 0 through 10, it's like a 3. Could have put Tower of London, maybe, a scaffold.
It's a good cartoon.
Thank you. A New Yorker, right here. Thank you. How about this one? Client, the female, I hope he treats the problem I have, and the therapist, I hope she has the problem I treat. You're like, oh, now you like it. So that's, by the way, that's to look like Mark Goldfried. His son drew this for us. This is the old-fashioned way of personalizing. A good referral, a lucky match, and notice almost all of it implicit, right? Not even talking about it. Let's just hope there's a good match. My treatment method to the patient's problem or goal. We are so past that. So when I say personalizing therapy, friends, here's 5 ways that I mean it. I'm looking for direct research evidence of effectiveness. Okay? I need to see some studies that say this match, this fit works. I want to look at and see that it works across theoretical systems, and we're matching on clients' diagnostic as well as transdiagnostic features. In fact, I'm not really speaking about diagnosis at all today. We need to match both treatment method and therapy relationship. You'll see that most immediately in the stages of change. And of course, this doesn't occur only as case formulation at the beginning of therapy. Patients evolve, you evolve, so we need to be matching, personalizing across the course of therapy, not only pre-treatment. The central problem with this area of research, as many of you may know, is we can't agree on a single name. We got treatment selection, prescriptionism, differential therapeutics, treatment matching, tailoring. At least in the United States, you do that to clothes. Customizing, you do it to cars. If you're a geek like me, you talk about aptitude by treatment interaction. That is a client or a patient aptitude, like stage of change or reactance level, and that interacts with the treatment facet. Okay? By the way, I once said that to a patient. Don't do that. It just came out. I said, oh yeah, this is like aptitude by treatment interaction. There's not enough rupture repair in the world. Look at that moment, let me tell you. I have some unpublished research, and this is, again, on Yanks, United States only, that patients prefer strongly the words individualizing and personalizing. The personalizing probably because of personalized medicine, and the individualizing, virtually everybody says, oh, I know what that means. So when we introduce this, they're the two words. When we train, we tell people, at least in the United States, they probably work best. In the research literature, you'll see the two italicized terms most frequently. In the CBT tradition, they're called treatment adaptations. In the psychodynamic, relational, and humanistic tradition, we're more fond of responsiveness. But this blizzard of words also means we're not sure we're always talking about the same thing. So I'm going to call personalizing, individualizing, matching, whatever term you want. The process is fitting the individual client and that specific set of circumstances called the client. Okay? And I like to call this what every clinician knows. No treatment works for all patients. What works for one may not work for another. If we're only matching psychotherapy to a disorder, we know that will be incomplete and not always effective. Hence, we must adapt, personalize, individualize to the entirety of the patient, sometimes called whole care psychotherapy, whole person. You may have seen that as well. We've known this, at least in medicine, for a long time. One of the fathers of modern medicine, Sir William Osler, one of yours, by the way, in 1906, wrote, it is much more important to know what sort of a patient has a disease than what sort of a disease a patient has. For those of you, like a little conditional probability, this is a when-then. When the client presents with this feature, this cultural identity, this stage of change, this reactance level, this preference, then the research suggests you may want to use this. When, then. It's an old idea come to evidence-based fruition just in the last 20 or so years, really just in the last decade. In this way, we can now match to the entire person, not only to a disorder. So, assuming therapists would like an expanded repertoire of fitting, matching, or individualizing, which client features work. More than 200 have been proposed. Of those, about 100 have actually been investigated. So which should we use? That's why we've done the meta-analyses over the last 25 years. And here are 7, or in this case 6, patient features that serve as markers for doing something strong, doing something different. Let me give you an example, though we'll be getting into this in a moment. Reactance level. It's kind of like resistance, but it's a personality trait. Low reactance patients differ dramatically in how they respond from high reactance. Stage of change. If you are actively avoiding or denying your problem, that person's clearly going to need something different relationally in treatment than someone who accepts and says, help me beat this. Right? It just makes sense. So we're now able to do this with evidence-based certainty. at least with a high degree of probability. Okay? So you will have the slides, friends, for all 6 of these. We're going to be focusing largely on reactance level and stage of change. But let me point out as we go through all 6, just look at these effect sizes. 0.78 for reactance level. Okay? If you match to your patient's reactance level, you get an effect size of 0.78. It's remarkable. Culture, race, and ethnicity. By the way, I don't do this outside the United States because there's obviously so much difference. But cultural fit works. Culturally adapting therapy to a patient's cultural identities works. It's not just a value. It's not just social justice. To be sure, we should do it for that reason. But it also works. It improves their success. There's lots of ways of adapting. By the way, language is number 1, which always seemed pretty obvious to me. Preferences. Mick Cooper may know something about this. You may notice a Cooper there. Did you get kidded here about Cooper drives this boat? You will now. There's a famous movie. The guy's driving like this. They stole a boat, and he screams, "Cooper drives this boat." So I've always wondered. No, you're welcome. Every student, right? Just go like this. Cooper drives this boat. All right. Religion, spiritual accommodative therapies. Right? Does that happen here? Yeah. By the way, now good treatment manuals for spiritual accommodative therapy, Christian, Jews, Muslims. I'm missing one that I can't think of immediately. But if a patient comes in and says, "Can you pray with me? My faith is important to my life," then you can accommodate to their religion without, by the way, converting to their religion. You just need to know enough with some cultural humility to say yes. If you tell me specifically how, and that's legally and clinically appropriate behavior, it has a big difference. Okay? Remember, you have the slides. And the stages of change. Coping style, for those smattering of you who see kids, you already know this, right? You have internalizing disorders versus externalizing disorders. The internalizing are stereotypically like a 10-year-old silent, withdrawn, depressed girl. Your externalizers are, a 7-year-old ADHD or conduct disorder boy, right? So some internalizing disorders do better with certain types of therapy. It's exactly the same thing with adults. So this meta-analysis, based on 18 studies by Larry Butler and colleagues, finds a medium effect size. Certain treatments work better depending upon the coping style. Specifically, interpersonal and insight-oriented treatments are more effective among internalizing. Think Freud. Or another way of thinking about it, think if Freud had a 10-year-old attention deficit conduct disorder running around on his couch, messing with his antiquities. Do you think he would still try to say, be on the couch and start free associating? No, he wouldn't. He would be doing symptom focus and skill building in a moment too. Okay. So, which type of therapy is better? Depends upon the patient, specifically their coping style. This is huge. If we had more hours, this is another one we could talk about. But, by the way, attachment style, also huge. You have that, as well as gender identity and sexual orientation. But we don't have enough randomized clinical trials on these yet. So they're in that category of we know they're important, we just don't have the research yet to speak about them. Someone else looking for a dissertation, here it is. Oh, I should mention this. I'm asked quite frequently, well, shouldn't we be then routinely matching therapist-patient dyads, say on the basis of gender? Woman client, woman therapist, or how about ethnicity, religion, and spirituality? For years, we've been expecting and looking for this, and we can't find it. It's very disappointing. Until someone suggested automatically matching on that doesn't make sense unless the clients say they want it. So it turns out there are huge effects, but the effects are due to the client's preferences. So we've done some large work with HMOs on the West Coast of the United States, showing huge improvements, just asking clients for their preferences, and then accommodating when they can. Okay? Been fabulous results. So before we go on to the skills training part, what you just saw, since we came back from break, these are randomized clinical trials. So we can make causal conclusions. We can say, when you match to the patient's stage of change, you're likely to improve their outcomes, however you measure them, by anywhere from 20 to 32%, right? Because you're allowed to manipulate and randomly assign patients to those sort of things. But be mindful, there is a possibility of investigator allegiance on several of these. But as the research grows, not as important. Mick, in your meta-analysis, there were what, 100 studies? So we probably don't have researcher allegiance. It could still be file drawer phenomenon in others, but that's not a real risk because the research base is now huge. But the second one certainly afflicts us, and that is the overlap between these. So I'll be speaking in a few moments about how you're going to quickly identify and match to the patient's reactance level and stages of change. I'll present them separately, but know there's a correlation of 0.3 between them. Okay? So not so separate. Likewise, a person's cultural identities and their preferences are surely related. And there's good research to suggest that, but I just presented the meta-analyses as discrete and distinctive, when in fact they're probably related. Okay. So, personalized psychotherapy, quite similar to the premise of precision or personalized medicine, sometimes predicated on the patient's disorder, but always predicated on the person, what we'll call transdiagnostic characteristics. So before the skill building, let's talk about how powerful these are for a moment. So I know I've showed lots of numbers, but the take-home is adapting, individualizing therapy to the entire person, improves success and decreases dropout. And I should say, at least in the 7 to 10 ways we've identified. You saw 6 that we know work, several we suspect work, but not quite enough research. If you fit therapy to the patients by those client features, we know this works. This is not clinical lore, but established fact. And when you do so, it'll be far more powerful than doing treatment method A for disorder B. So let me give you an example. Here is a typical effect size, Cohen's D, as you can see, between treatment A and treatment B. If the D was 0, no difference between the effectiveness of the treatments, the line would be absolutely overlapping, so there'll only be one line. Everybody with me on that? So a D is 0, the same, there'd be one line. This is the highest effect size shown for particular treatment methods for a particular disorder. In this case, it is some form of exposure therapy for PTSD. That's capital T trauma, right? Not lower T trauma. So for example, we know if you do, say, prolonged exposure or EMDR or narrative exposure or CBT trauma-focused therapy, that works a little better than non-exposure therapies. It does. It's one of the few exceptions where the dodo bird doesn't quite apply. It works just a little bit better. That little bit better is a D of 0.2. So if you have trauma patients offering some form of exposure, and by the way, there's 5 or 6 varieties, pick them, will work a little bit better. So that's certainly worth knowing about and doing. But you'll notice the D of 0.2 is kind of small. It's in D, right? The D, it's small. By contrast, what you've seen just in the last few minutes in the meta-analyses, these are the kind of effect sizes you get. 0.5 at the top and 0.8. These are the average effect sizes. So you want to move a patient from the blue to the, what would you call that here? Salmon, pink? Fuchsia?
Magneto.
All right, no one. The other line, that's what's happening. Okay? So what we've covered today, therapy, relationship, effect sizes, therapist personalization, to trains diagnostic, you get this. So now imagine, and this has to happen here because they do it everywhere. You're now at the optometrist. You're at your eye doctor. And they say, which looks clearer and bigger to you? Is it just learning more treatment methods and matching it to disorders? Well, you get that. Or is it working on a relationship and matching to the patient, as we're talking about today? Which is clear. A, B. Remember they keep doing that and we keep switching it up? Very annoying. So when people ask me, why do you keep talking about this? Because this is what matters, right? Come on. This is helpful. I have a Systems of Psychotherapy book, right? I believe in different systems and theory and integration, but this is making the difference, folks. And remember, we started with this. You notice in your bones as both a clinician and a client. It is the relationship, it is the fit. We need not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say treatment methods don't work. But if you want to make the difference, this is what we do. So with that said, let's talk about quickly identifying, assessing, and then matching to a patient's stage of change and reactance level. You would save me lots of time if when I say pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance, most people nod. Do we know that? Yeah, we good?
Is this the recovery model, John?
Is he ever cooperative or is this just him?
Is this the recovery model, is it? I've seen something like this in the recovery.
Well, the original work was in the addictions, but it's now been applied to everything imaginable. So our first large grants were, but if you search stages of change, you now find over 50,000 citations. Ooh, yes. All right, so quickly. For any behavioral problem, you quickly move through stages of change. Pre-contemplation, and I will be quick on this. Pre-contemplation, you notice denial? Raise your hand if you find denial a flattering term. Of course not, so why would you say to someone they're in denial? You just insulted them. Terrible idea. Pre-contemplation designates you're not ready yet. Everybody get that? So pre-contemplation. You then move into contemplation, where you acknowledge the problem, but you're not ready to get there yet. Here's a great example. The Israeli psychotherapist, Alfred Benjamin, tells this wonderful story. He was sitting in his office one day, a guy came up and said, how do I get to this location? Benjamin provided the specific locations, gave the specific instructions. The man understood, said thank you, and then started walking the opposite direction. Benjamin calls out and says, sir, you're heading in the wrong way. The man says, yeah, I know, I'm not ready yet. That's contemplation. He knew where he wanted to go. After that is a very brief stage of preparation. We initially called this decision making, but it's more than that. This is baby steps, right? So there's an intention to change while you're making little baby steps, because we know this entails just so much anxiety. Then you're into the action stage, which sadly most of the world conflates with the entirety of change. Right? They think, well, now you're changing your environment, your behavior, so that's change. Hell no. The entire thing is change. And then action, of course, it's just not getting there. You need to stay there. That's maintenance. And technically, it's maintenance and generalization. Maintaining the behavior over time and generalizing to outside the therapist office. Okay? A gaggle of graduate students at University of Miami memorably gave me noises for this. Pre-contemplation. Nah. Right? They got no problem. Contemplation. We'll skip preparations. Getting there. Action is roar, right? Because you're moving, you're making these huge leaps. And then my favorite noise, and wait for it, there's two. Maintenance. You're finally there. It's, oh shit. The oh shit is you can then relapse, right? By the way, It's amazing, for the first 40 years of psychotherapy research, we never looked at relapse. Right? Someone changed, we were happy, get rid of them, go 6 months, and let's just hope no one relapses. It was only most of the research in the addiction said we need to be looking at relapse. And that's why Stages of Change began in relapse, by the way. First 3 big grants were smoking, alcohol, and then both. All right, we got that? By the way, you don't just go through this once, particularly when people relapse, though we prefer the word recycle. So you go around and around. The average woman who suffers from major depressive disorder will probably have 5 episodes their entire life. People who have New Year's resolutions, we've actually done some research on this, from the Stages of Change perspective, they take from 5 to 7 times. The average person trying to lose weight and keep it off takes an average of 394. Just made that up. Who knows, right? No one even knows. But it's not a one-time shot, right? That's the stages of change. You're going around and around in a spiral. A frequent misconception. Therapist says, I think you're what we therapists refers to the pre-contemplation stage, client, but says the normal people just call you a stubborn bastard. That's a misconception because the stages of change are state. It's behavior specific. You may be in pre-contemplation for the cocaine abuse, in contemplation for extramarital affairs, in action to combat your depression, and I don't know, maintenance for teeth flossing. Another annoying over self-disclosure. Yes, someone has to keep flossing. So this is reactance level. Stages of change is state. Behavior or goal specific. This is reactance. Okay? Population prevalence, not the prevalence who are treatment seeking, but for any behavior, again, there's thousands of studies on this. As a general rule, 40% of the population for any observable behavior is in pre-contemplation. Here's a quick way of doing that. Think of all the smokers you currently know. 40% are saying, get off my back, I'm going to smoke forever, I can't do it, just leave me alone. About 40% saying, yeah, it's a filthy habit, one day I'll do it. And if you think of 10 smokers, 1 or 2 right now are probably trying to stop. Okay? So we've done that with depression, anxiety, and there's just a few exceptions. But that's not the people who come to your office, right? But if you take a population interest, as Jim Prochaska, my colleague, and most of this work does, this is what the world looks like. So, why does this matter? Because there are large effect sizes. First, stages of change predict who fares well, who is going to do well. And you don't need a meta-analysis to figure this out. If you don't want therapy and you don't have a problem, then that's not a good prognosis. On the other hand, someone accepts their disorder, ready to change it, and wants your help with it, in the action stage, they do really quite well. Yes. In fact, I always tell my trainees, their very first patients should be adjustment disorders in the action stage. Instead, we usually give them some poor borderline in the pre-contemplation stage. Right? Now, we should be starting easy, right? Give you the easy ones. So, different things for different times, right? This is the idea of stage matching. And you're just not matching treatment methods, you're also matching the relationship, which we'll show you now. But before that, we need to break back into your treasured dyads, and within 40 to 50 seconds, reliably assess the stages of change for a particular problem or goal. If you have a goal orientation, that's fine, just use the goal. If you have more of a diagnosis or problem orientation, you use that. So, thank you, Mick. Do you currently have a problem with smoking?
No.
No. By definition, if Mick says no, he's in pre-contemplation, if he's in fact smoking, or he's in maintenance. Did you ever smoke?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're in long-term maintenance. Well done. Okay, everybody get that? But that's the decision matrix. All right? By the way, we also do have what in the United States we call the Obama problem. Obama thought he was in long-term maintenance because he never carried cigarettes, but his Social Security detail gives him 4 or 5 cigarettes a day. But he still believes he doesn't smoke. Yes. Okay? Since Mick says no, I immediately says, I'm curious, because you know, we're always wondering, curious therapists. What leads you to say that? And he would say, for smoking, because you haven't smoked.
I don't smoke.
In years.
In years.
In years. Good answer. All right. Everybody got that? So we got. So he's in the maintenance stage. Just make something up. Who's got a disorder here? Someone just throw me a disorder. A goal. You don't know disorders over here? All right, depression. Again, just keep continuing. Do you currently have a problem with depression?
Yes, John, I do.
All right. Then we ask, when will you change it? Now, some people think that's a little too direct, and so you can modify that and say, well, what's your thoughts about changing it? It's fine. If he were to say,
I'd like to change it, but it's really hard.
so that's the preparation stage, right? He'd like to. If he says someday with a dreamy look, right, that's contemplation. If he says right now, it's action stage. But be careful here. Many people say, I would like to change it right now, but they're not ready. So we're looking for behavioral criteria here. I'm ready to go. So we get this. It's just these questions, and you can see if you have a cooperative partner, this would have taken 32 seconds, right? Because they're looking at the frickin' screen. And I think gave you such a wonderful introduction. You just can't play it. All right, so your therapist, you're just going to ask these questions, ask it for different stages, and at the end, turn to your partner and say, okay, are you thinking your contemplation or pre-contemplation? Or you'll notice preparation isn't here. It's such a transitory, quick, evolving stage that we barely assess that. But everyone should be asking about a pre-contemplation problem or goal, contemplation, action, and maintenance. Okay?
Just a question, isn't preparation though a huge bunch of action? I have...
It's tiny. If you go more than baby steps, you moved into action.
Okay.
So preparation, it's an intention. You're a little anxious about it, so you take little baby steps. So for smoking, it would be on gradually reducing nicotine, but you haven't stopped. The moment you stop, you're in action. Make sense? Small changes versus complete reduction.
Sure. But I was thinking in terms of addiction services, and so the preparation is I found out about the programs at the local service. It hasn't gone yet.
So one of my favorite jokes of all time was Anna Freud answered a question by saying, being in psychotherapy is the most sophisticated defense mechanism she'd ever witnessed. You can hide out there and not change.
Yes.
So if you said one of your treatment goals is to get into treatment, then that's a goal for being in treatment. But being in treatment is quite different than saying, where are you for stopping the addictive substance? Because they can just hide. Everybody get it? So ask 3 or 4 questions and check with your client that you're accurate in your assessments. And then just, of course, switch it back. Should just take 30 seconds. One more minute, please. We only have about 20 minutes, and I've been informed by reliable observers if I go late, the crowd will turn ugly. That's a knowing recognition right there. All right. This has now been applied to every imaginable behavior. It works. It's also been applied to institutional change, organizational change. As the gentleman said, it began out in addictions, but now everything imaginable, just put in stages of change. This works. There are more formal ways of measuring stages of change. Only use those for research purposes. Okay? This works. It's what we've all been using for the last 40 years. Now, why does it matter that you have the patient's stage of change, at least for a particular problem? Because, of course, they're usually coming with multiple problems, so you'll be in multiple stages of change. Well, because once we understand the stages of change, we know what is most likely to work effectively. We call these the change processes, or change principles, rather than specific techniques. So, briefly, it goes like this. When someone comes denying the problem, they need consciousness-raising methods to make themselves more aware of themselves, their emotions, and their defenses. Forget about social liberation for a moment, but we know information alone isn't enough, otherwise we tell everyone stop smoking, right? That's not happening. So we also need emotional arousal, affect, plus information, plus a self-reevaluation. This is not the person I want to be. So those three change processes move people from not me, nah, to I'm considering it in preparation. In preparation, commitment methods and strategies then move people from thinking about it to doing it. Once into action and continuing to maintain it, you suddenly then become a bit of a CB tier. You're rewarding, you're countering, a fancy word for counter conditioning, or the healthy opposite, or reciprocal inhibition. You're teaching new skills, be that thinking, relaxation, or the like. And most people forget, except in 12-step groups, we're also changing the environment. We need new people, places, and things. Okay? So, who's the most effective therapist? It is the therapist who systematically matches change methods to the patient's stages of change. And you'll recall those effect sizes were 0.7 and 0.8. Now, seasoned therapists, you're already doing this. If someone were to come in and say, I know my problem, you're not going to spend sessions with them saying, well, let's talk about your defense mechanisms so you get to know your problem better. Okay? Or if they're really ready to go, it would be the disheartening therapist who would say, well, let's talk about your motivation again. If they're ready, you help them keep going, right? Yes, that's exactly what we want. So it's stage matching, doing the right thing to the right time. By the way, what we particularly like about the model, the Transtheoretical model, or stages of change as it's more popularly known, is it is integrative, and under each of these change processes, we could, and it was my original intent to do one of these, we can come up with at least 10 specific techniques or methods for any of the change processes. So you use whatever is within your repertoire. So counter-conditioning, the principle is substituting healthy response for the problem behaviors. Do the opposite or something else. So you can teach them a new skill, you can divert them, behavioral activation, exercise, relaxation, acceptance, cognitive restructuring, delayed impulse control, whatever it is for that particular problem, right? It's something else. But imagine trying to do counter-conditioning if they're denying the problem. That would just seem silly. And yet, I watch lots of videotape and I see people doing it. In fact, there are the two big mismatches in the stages. People come in ready to go into action, but they get a fairly psychodynamic therapist who wants to talk things through and completely misses, right? And that, of course, is one of the standard criticisms of relational psychodynamic work. You know, insight alone doesn't bring behavior change. But you also see the other people. I see CBT therapists saying, well, we don't have a goal, but let's do some homework and let's work on a new behavior, when the person doesn't even know or accept what they're working on. Okay? So I know it sounds silly to say it out loud. It happens a lot. So I mentioned to you, stages of change are also then tailored to the therapy relationship. And you already know this intuitively. So here's a way of doing this in your own mind. Think about a problem that you're currently experiencing in each of these stages of change. So, flossing is a silly one, but it's the one that came to mind for maintenance. What kind of relationship would I want from a therapist, a friend, or someone when I'm in maintenance? I'm in action. What would I want? By the way, these are the marker items from the Stages of Change questionnaire, also called the Eureka questionnaire. So someone in contemplation would heavily endorse the item, I've been considering changing that part of myself. Okay? What would I need from that person? So it goes something like this. In pre-contemplation, your stance, your optimal stance for that patient discussing that goal or problem is like the nurturing parent in pre-contemplation. You love them, you accept them unconditionally, and yet you hope that they are going to move forward. Okay? And you're joining with them. They're defensive, they're anxious, but you still love them. Once they're in contemplation, you become like Socrates, doing both the cognitive and affective work, like in the Socratic dialogues, right? Because the patient do their own work. Once you're into action, you look like a crazed behavior therapist, helping them move through. We call that experienced coach. And then finally, in maintenance, you're spending a little less time on that problem, perhaps on other things, but you're guarding against relapse, and that's called the coach. So what's your optimal stance as a therapist? It depends upon the patient's stage of change you're working with. From the nurturing parent, to the Socratic teacher, to the experienced coach, to the consultant. Okay? That's stage matching. By the way, I guarantee seasoned clinicians you're doing this. So if you leave here thinking, I kind of knew that, but now you're a little more efficient and systematic, I'm delighted. By the way, trainees, don't go OCD on me. I know we're throwing out lots of things here. Next week, don't try to do all these things with your next patient. Just take one or two you and your supervisor think is compatible with your style, and then work with that, come up to competence, and when you're feeling comfortable and competent in that, then add the next one. I can't tell you how many people say that next session, you wait to see how empathic I am. And I'm going to pounce on every rupture, and I'm going to stage match, and I'm like, oh my God. And you're just completely ignoring your patient. Yes, that's not my take-home message. So seasoned clinicians make you more efficient doing this. Trainees, one at a time, gradually assimilate, right? And that's how it gets done. By the way, for training purposes, here's another way of thinking about how systems of psychotherapy fit within stages of change. Every psychotherapy system has a place, a specific and differential place. For patients in pre-contemplation and contemplation, these are the therapies that have historically worked most effectively. And then once you're over here, it's these. So old-timers may recognize this as the awareness therapies, the action therapies. Sadly, we find that when most people train, after they get proficient in one therapy, they do a therapy in the same category. Bam! Now, please be proficient in these methods. Not all the therapies, just one of them. Help patients primarily in pre-contemplation and contemplation, then in action and maintenance. Okay? You don't have to be expert in all of them. Just help people move through the stages of change. And that's what the next slides are. So I'll move quickly to these. You're going to assess the patient's stage of change. You're going to educate the patient about stages. By the way, if you just ask people, and I'm sorry we don't have time, but a good example is I can usually get someone to talk about their experience with changing smoking behavior, right? They used to smoke, now they don't. They'll usually, if I say, how do you change? They'll usually go right to the action stage. I'll say politely, excuse me, was there a time you were smoking when you didn't think it's a problem? They'll say, yes, that was 6 years. All right, then I said, then you tried? Yes. Oh, and I failed. So they are demonstrating the cycle. And then I'll say, when did it finally work? So people intuitively have already lived the stages of change. Okay? So just go through, let's talk about the time you've changed. They will give you the stages of change. And indeed, patients did give us the stages of change. This comes from their responses, not ours. Beware treating all patients as though they are in action. We would like them to be all in action because they do so much better, but they're not. Period. Which is why when someone says you have 6 sessions, I said you should have 6 sessions to move someone from pre-contemplation to contemplation. Then, when they're in action, you get 6 sessions. It's ridiculous to think you're going to move someone from pre-contemplation to long-term maintenance in 6 sessions. Really, it's just obscene. But these are the same people, right? Begin sessions by reinforcing maintenance behaviors, then moving back. People ask all the time, if they got multiple problems, how do I sequence this? This actually comes from long-term friend, Marsha Linehan. If you know DBT, we start with reinforcement of goals. So let's say with Mick, I'd say fine. If you've recently been struggling with and tempted to renew smoking, let's spend a few minutes on that. He immediately feels successful, it's empowering, and then we move backwards to other stages. Okay? The only exception to that is if there's anything immediately self-damaging or self-injurious, then of course that's the priority target. But otherwise, start that way. Set realistic goals. Assist clients one stage at a time. No stage skipping. Facilitate the awareness cross-action crossover. Many people believe they're just trying to get their patients into action as quickly as possible. Research shows this is an awful idea. This is imposed and forced change. The early awareness stuff fuels, motivates, and commits the patient to the action. Forcing them just to take action is, just going to last a week and a half, and then you're all going to be upset. Do the right thing at the right time. Remember, we're stage matching treatments and relationships. And you're going to build in relapse prevention, since we know about the high rates of relapse. And the theoretical complementarity is right there. Which is better, which just fits a particular patient. They all fit. Right? They all just have their domains of expertise. And that has important consequences for training. So you want one sort of like if you go to a Chinese restaurant, one from column A, one from column B. It's exactly what we want. All right. So, reactants. How many minutes do I have? About 3. Shit. All right. I tried. So you have the slides. Reactance level is now trait. Stages of change, state, right? Specific on the behavior and the context. Reactance, on the other hand, is a personality trait. It's with us forever. And it refers to being easily provoked and responding oppositionally to external demands. It exists on a normal curve, a Gaussian curve, right? Some people low, some people high. The people who are low are very compliant in the pathological extreme, dependent personality. The people who are defined, pathological extreme, probably antisocial, narcissistic. Why does this matter? Because it's a Klein marker for optimal degree of directiveness. So the next time you're asked the classic question, how directive of a therapist are you? You're going to stun the questioner and say, it depends upon my client. Snap. Why? Because in the RCTs, look at that effect size, 0.78. Now, anyone who's been in practice and seen more than 3 clients knows you're just going to have a battle of wills if you try to be directed with a highly reactant, non-compliant patient, right? You just know you're going to lead from the back of the boat, as we say. Doesn't mean you don't do anything. Whereas those people low in reactance will get better quicker by you being more directive. So when to be directive, it depends upon the client. All right, so as we conclude, which therapy works better? It does honestly depend. Stages, reactance level, culture, treatment goals, and the like. But do remember, it depends more on the relationship and the responsiveness than the treatment method. And that indeed is the sea change many of us of my generation have experienced. You know, we just used to talk endlessly, really narcissistically about what's my preferred theoretical orientation. So imagine you just going to your physician and saying, well, what kind of medicine do you practice? And they didn't tell you about a specialty, but someone said, well, I'm an antibiotic therapist. You would say, what? You know, it's almost becoming like that. You know, I treasure our proficiencies, but we ought to be saying, well, tell me about the client, and I'll tell you what I'm likely to do. That's been a huge sea change. And it speaks well for the maturity of both practice and research that we can say such things. So, in the end, friends, before you leave, let me thank you for joining me for the day with a few reminders. Seasoned practitioners, I suspect you know, at least intuitively, a good deal of what I've said today. So I will reiterate, if you leave here feeling more systematic and efficient about doing these things, I will be pleased indeed. Trainees, do not go OCD. Pick a few of these. Some of this is new, a lot of knowledge, potential skills here. Pick the things you think will work for you. And 3 take-homes. You're going to cultivate and customize the therapy relationship, and science can direct you on that now. You're going to use these research particularities to fit the patient particulars, and you will tailor responsibly to the entire person. So I will leave you with this wonderful parable that I've stolen from Norton Juster's delightful book, The Phantom Toll Booth. It summarizes pretty much what I've been trying to say today, maybe a little more metaphorical than literally. Because as psychotherapists develop, they see the world in more complex, relativistic, pluralistic ways. In other words, the better therapists grow up rather than down. So it goes like this. Our protagonist is Milo. Milo has just emerged from a deep, dark woods and sees before him this rich green landscape. Milo gasps, what a beautiful view. From the side of him, answers a strange voice, oh, I don't know. It's all the way you look at things. Milo turns to his side and finds himself staring at 2 very neatly polished brown shoes hovering 3 feet above the ground. And the boy's head is up here, and his feet are there. The boy continues and says, well, if you happen to like deserts, you might not think this is beautiful at all. look at that bucket of water over there. Okay? In the ant's point of view, it's a vast ocean. From an elephant's point of view, it's a cool drink. And to a fish, of course, it's home. So you see, the strange boy continues, the way you see things depends a great deal on where you look at them. Milo is shocked. See this boy with his head up here and his feet here just standing in the air like that. So Milo says, yes, how do you manage to stand up there in the mid-air like that? Well, the strange boy says, in my family, everyone is born in the air with our head at exactly at the height it's going to be when we're an adult. And then we all grow toward the ground. When we're fully grown down, our feet finally touch. The strange boy says to Milo, you must certainly be very old to have reached the ground already. No, Milo says seriously. In my family, we all start on the ground and grow up, and we never know how far till we get there. Well, the strange boy begins to laugh. He says, that's a ridiculous system. Then your head keeps changing its height, and you'll always see things in a different way. Why, when you're 15, things don't look at all like when they're 25, and then at 50, everything changes again. The boy continued, we always see things from the same angle. It's much less trouble that way. But Milo's a persistent little lad. He says, does everyone here grow the way you do? The strange boy thinks for a moment, and then replies, almost everyone. Now and then, though, someone does begin to grow differently. Instead of down, their feet grow up toward the sky. But we do our very best to discourage awkward things like that. Milo insists, well, what happens to those people? The strange boy says, oddly enough, they grow 10 times the size of everyone else, and I've heard they walk among the stars. And with that, they skip off toward the far-off woods together. So there it is, friends. Responsiveness in relationships is growing up, not down. So thank you so much again.